So my name is Chris. I'm one of the pastors here at OU. I just want to say happy Father's Day to you who are celebrating Father's Day. Some of you celebrate your fathers because you had great fathers. Some of you, this is a day of it's just a strange day because perhaps you are estranged from your father. Maybe your father has given you too much. Maybe your father has not given you enough. Part of what it means to be a pastor is, especially I've been here for five years, which means I know some of your stories. And I know that for some of you, this is a day when you are remembering the loss of your father or loss of a child. And we bring all of that into the room. But we're glad that you're here because this summer we're in a sermon series called Encounter Creation. And Encounter Creation is an opportunity for us to look at creation theology within the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. And we're on that journey together. But we're also asking you to go outside this summer, to take the Bible outdoors and read it out there. And then also to take pictures as you travel, as you go on vacation, as you move about your backyards. And here are a few pictures from this week that folks have taken and posted on social media using the hashtag EncounterCreation. It's something that you can do too. Spread the love, spread the beauty of creation, and let us know where you've been and what you're doing. I was telling folks last week that I'm incredibly jealous of some of the vacations that you take, and that's okay. That's fine. I can live vicariously through you, through your social media posts, so that's fine. We're going to go to the beach in a week or so. We're excited about that. So there's that. Yeah. So today, we're looking at the book of Job. The reason we're looking at the book of Job is because Job has an encounter with God in creation. In chapter 38 of Job, you hear that the Lord answered Job from the whirlwind, from within this great windstorm. To understand what's going on with the windstorm and the whirlwind and the answering of Job, you have to kind of get a sense of what's going on in the book. Now, reading the book of Job and interpreting the book of Job have never been easy for Christians, for Israelites, for anybody. Not an easy book to read or to interpret. One of the church fathers, Jerome, once said about the book of Job that it was kind of like an eel, that if you reached down into the water and picked it up and you tried to squeeze it, the harder you squeeze the eel, it's just going to slither out of your hand and escape you. Similar with the book of Job, the more you try to pin it down and squeeze meaning and interpretation out of it, the more it's just going to escape your grasp. There's no way, I just want to make a caveat at the beginning of the sermon, there's no way in one sermon to plumb the depths of the mysteries of this book. The best thing that could possibly happen, I think, at the end of the sermon is that you are intrigued enough that you go try to read this book on your own. And once you read it, you come back and talk to me and we'll have a conversation about it. You can tell me what it means. But the book, it's set up as a kind of parable, as a kind of fable. It's almost Shakespearean in character, like a film from the Coen brothers or something. You get these scenes, and here's the first scene. You're introduced to the main central character. There once was a man who lived in the land of Uz, whose name was Job. He was a righteous man. He was described as blameless and upright, who feared the Lord and turned away from evil. And he was also really rich. He had several sons, 7 sons, 3 daughters. He had more oxen and sheep and cattle than all the farmers in Mississippi. I mean, this guy was really wealthy, but he was also really good. He was a good person. After he's introduced, the camera kind of pans back into the second scene, into the heavenly throne room where God is having a conversation with Hasatan. Say Hasatan. Hasatan, who the great accuser, who comes to God and has been lurking around the earth looking for someone, and comes to God and says, I need a target. And God says, well, what about Job? He said, well, Hasatan says, well, Job is, he's righteous, but the reason he's righteous is because of all the prosperity and blessing that you have placed upon his life. And if you took all that stuff away, then he would curse you, God, to your face. And God accepts the challenge, very strange, and gives Hasatan permission to take away all Job's stuff. And that gives way to the third scene. And in the third scene, what you see is all of these great misfortunes that fall upon Job's life. He loses all of his stuff in like 3 sentences. He loses his oxen and cattle and sheep. He loses his children. He loses his health. When he loses his health, it's terrible, the description. It says that he has worms kind of in his skin, and he has these boils that are itching. And it describes in chapter 2, verse 8, that he was sitting there with a potsherd in his hand, just a piece of a pot, and he's scraping the boils, presumably because they're itching so bad, and he's sitting among the ashes. It's not good for Job. This guy's suffering greatly. His wife looks at him and says, "Why do you persist in your integrity? Curse God and die." So basically, do the thing that Hasatan has said you would do. And he says, "Shall we receive the good at the hand of God and not receive the bad?" And all this, the narrator says, Job did not sin with his lips. He's a really good guy. He's truly righteous, and he's not going to renounce his integrity even when he experiences suffering. And that gives way to the fourth scene. And this is where it kind of becomes Shakespearean in character, where it's as if you've got these 4 characters on stage. There's Job and all of his friends. And you hear in chapter 2, verse 11, kind of the scene. Now, when Job's 3 friends heard of all the troubles that had come upon Job, each of them came to him, set out from his home. There's Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar, and they meet together and they go to comfort and console Job. When they get to him, they don't even recognize him. They don't even recognize his appearance. And they tear their clothes and they throw dust in the air and they sit down beside him for 7 days in silence because they don't even know what to say. My New Testament professor in seminary once was talking about suffering, and he said that in a time when his wife, who was always in need of care, was in the hospital, that he decided one of the ways that he could comfort his wife, who was in a great deal of pain, was to read to her the book of Job. Not a good idea. He said it was when I was younger and more stupid than I am already. He said, "I discovered quickly that words of great nobility cannot even be heard by one whose body is being tortured." I learned eventually that simple silence and holding her hand was better than any eloquence, even the eloquence of the Bible. For 7 days, they sat there with their friend who was suffering greatly, and they didn't say a word. They sat in silence. But maybe like you, when your friends are suffering, the silence, it's as if you just can't stay with it long enough. You want to give words to the experience. You want to explain and justify what's happening. And that was the case for Job's friends as well. And so you get this back and forth between Job and his friends where silence gives way to speech, and they debate the issues that are going on, the turmoil and the suffering and the pain, the moral coherence of the universe, the justice, the possibility of justice, the nature and character of God. Over the course of many chapters, you see this debate unfold, and it basically goes like this. Job says, "I'm innocent, y'all. I didn't do anything. Nothing has happened to deserve all of this." And their friends say, "Job, I understand that you think you're innocent, man. But here's the thing, you wouldn't be suffering like this if you were innocent. The only reason that God brings this kind of suffering is because you've done something, man. You've sinned in some way. There's something that you've done wrong. You're not completely pure. The reason that you're suffering is because God has brought a curse because you've done something wrong. You need to just fess up to it, man. We don't know what it is, but I know you do. Tell the truth about it. and then God will remove the suffering and you'll be blessed again. But that's not what happens. Job persists in his innocence. And he says about his friends that they are miserable comforters. You ever thought about that? It's like next time you're in a great deal of pain and your friends come to you and they say something like, everything happens for a reason, man. You can say to them, on the words of Job, you're a miserable comforter. Anyway, he responds in scorn, and he says over and again that he has not done anything wrong, and a just God would not treat anybody so harshly. And he's patient in his suffering, and he persists. And ultimately, he ends up getting kind of angry. He defends his integrity. He vows his innocence. He's convinced that there's a situation here where a wrong needs to be righted, and it's God who's in the wrong. And it gives way from the kind of piety of the beginning to he gets angry. He starts complaining against God. He says, among other things, that God is intrusive and suffering, unforgiving, and obsessed with destroying a human target. God is angry, fixated on punishment, hostile, and destructive. And all of these things are in the book of Job. I'm telling you, you should go read this stuff. It's crazy. And then he shifts from the injustice of his own experience to the suffering of the broader governance that God is offering to the rest of the world. He suggests, Job does, that the wicked are taking advantage of the needy and the helpless and the widow and the orphan. They remain in significant hardship, and God does nothing to punish them. This is Job's complaint. What's interesting, if you read this story in light of the context of the Old Testament, you see something more, something different. In the Old Testament, you have this dominant theological paradigm or perspective that comes from Moses and Deuteronomy that sets the terms of engagement between God and God's people, Israel. And it basically goes like this. And it's a way of understanding suffering. And it's very similar, actually, to contemporary culture. And it basically says this: suffering is a sign that something is wrong, right? That the ideal world would be one without suffering. That in the moral imagination of God's law, that God blesses the righteous with long life and prosperity and security and children. But it follows that if you are experiencing poverty or infertility or illness or instability or early death, all of those things are signs of God's curse. This is the paradigm that shapes the Hebrew moral imagination around suffering. Righteousness means that you should be free from suffering, and unrighteousness should demand suffering. And this is where Job comes in. Job comes in as a challenge to the dominant paradigm, a restatement of Israelite theology. He moves away from just the piety that kind of sits back and says, God, you must be right and I must be wrong. And he moves into a challenge of God that's quite provocative and one that makes, I think, several people a bit uncomfortable in the way in which Job seems to be provoking God and calling God to account. Job even imagines putting God on trial. Again, you just need to read this stuff. And so that goes back and forth for several chapters until you get to the next scene where Job is beginning to get exasperated. When he begins to wonder if there is any wisdom that can be found, he wonders and writes this beautiful, eloquent poem about wisdom. And at the end, he basically asserts that wisdom is hidden from humanity altogether. Then comes a young whippersnapper in the next scene named Elihu. And Elihu comes in and says, all you guys have it wrong. He said, wisdom comes from God. God is righteous. There is justice in God. Don't give up on God, basically. And at the end of Elihu's speeches, you get the climax of the whole book of Job, which is this moment when the Lord speaks from the whirlwind. And it's truly this tour de force. It's an amazing accomplishment of ancient literature, if you just take it as literature. I mean, just think about like how challenging it would be to put yourself as you're writing and composing the book, the story, this tale, and then you come to a moment where God is going to speak to Job. I wouldn't take that up. That's crazy. And what you hear is this powerful response. And that's what we're looking at this morning. And we're going to look at several of the verses. We're not looking at the whole thing. It's 38, 39, 40, and 41 if you want to go read it later. We're just going to look at about 25 verses. I'm going to summarize the rest. But I want you to get a sense of the force of this response from God. So this is Job 38. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind, "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up your loins like a man." I never know how exactly to read that. Gird up your loins like a man. I don't know. It's like Monty Python style. Sorry. Is it sarcastic? Is it angry? Is it mockery? What is God saying to Job? Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up your loins like a man. I will question you, and you shall declare to me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined the measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? And who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the heavenly beings shouted for joy? Let's stay there for a moment, Evan. Notice how it begins. Were you there at the foundation of the earth when everything was being created? The imagery is architectural in nature. It describes God as the architect and designer of the earth, laying its foundation, sinking its cornerstones. The morning stars and the heavenly beings shout for joy. And then he goes on. Or who shut in the sea with doors? The sea is this primordial image of chaos, and it's describing God as having control, even kind of setting up boundaries for the sea so it doesn't pervade or break those boundaries. There's a door that is shut in where the sea can't burst forth. But when it does burst forth, it doesn't do so violently and chaotically. It does so in the imagery of birth, giving something that has terrible force, but also with the vigor of new life. When I made the clouds its garment, and thick darkness its swaddling band, and prescribed bounds for it, set bars and doors, and said, thus far shall you come, and no farther, and here shall your proud waves be stopped. It goes on. Have you commanded the morning since your days began, and caused the dawn to know its place, so that it might take hold of the skirts of the earth, and the wicked be shaken out of it? It is changed like clay under the seal, and it's dyed like a garment. Light is withheld from the wicked, and their uplifted arm is broken. Have you entered into the springs of the sea, or walked into the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been revealed to you, or have you seen the gates of deep darkness? Have you comprehended the expanse of the earth? Declare if you know all of this. Where is the way to the dwelling of the light? And where is the place of darkness? That you may take it to its territory, and that you may discern the paths to its home. Surely you know, for you were born then, and the number of your days is great. Have you entered the storehouses of the snow, or have you seen the storehouses of the hail, which I have reserved for the time of trouble, for the day of battle and war? What is the way to the place where the light is distributed, and where the east wind is scattered upon the earth? You get the power of the response that God is making, the force, the unrelenting force of the rhetorical questions coming Job's way. Over and over, God asks, Who is this? Where were you? Could you do this? Have you done that? Do you know? And it's pushing on the incapacity of humanity and the supercapacity of God with things relating to the planning and governance of the created order of the earth. I mean, on one level, the meaning of this is really simple. God is God and Job is not. It's emphasizing the infinite distance between God and us, between God and humanity. God is not humanity's spoken in a loud voice. God has infinite distance and transcendence. He's immeasurably greater in power and knowledge and wisdom than we are, right? So that's part of the response. But I find that somehow unsatisfying as I've read the passage, because it doesn't leave me feeling very good about the times in my life where my world has been shattered, the times of my life where I've felt pain and suffering. Surely there's more going on, right? One of the things that's interesting, if you read this whole book, is that you see the ways in which Job's moral imagination is very limited and small. And you see that what God is doing is taking Job from the small little place in the little patch of ground that he was given to live and move and have his being. And God is taking him on this panoramic view of the whole of creation, all the way back to the beginning of things. Why is God doing that? Part of it, I think, is to shift and reorient Job in a particular kind of way. And you see it in one place within the speech. You see it in many places, but I'm just going to draw your attention to one of them right here in the next bit. So for Job, his moral imagination was all around the family and the village, and he was the center of the family, and his children were around him, and that completely gets shattered. He is the elder statesman in the village, and everybody would come around. He was the superior one, right? And all of that gets shattered as well. And so he begins to believe that there is only chaos to the universe, that God's order somehow is completely shattered, that God should be just, and God doesn't seem to be just because Job has experienced the shattering. And God steps back from Job's situation to say, do you see the full picture, man? Do you understand what's going on with the order of all things? Were you there at the very beginning? Will you be there at the end? There's more going on here. Now, some people have read this to say that God is just completely inscrutable, that God is beyond Job's questions, that the fact that God does not respond on Job's terms is a way of saying that God is beyond justice and injustice, and that he's inscrutable, and there's no getting to God's understanding or wisdom or mind. That's one way to read the passage, but I feel like it leaves something lacking. Other people will say this is just God putting Job in Job's place. And I don't find that particularly satisfying either. And it may be that God is trying to say, if there's justice here, to understand what justice is in the universe, you've got to understand all of history from the very beginning to the very end to understand how it all fits together. But I think there's something more going on. And it goes back to this passage that we brought up a moment ago, where God is reorienting Job's moral imagination by pointing to the desolate and wasted places of the earth. Who has cut a channel? Think about like the Panama Canal, right? Who has cut a channel for the torrents of rain and a way for the thunderbolt to bring rain on a land where no one lives, on the desert, which is empty of human life, to satisfy the waste and desolate land, and to make the ground put forth vegetation. For the ancient Hebrew people, the civilization was the place of life, and the wasteland was the place of emptiness and death. And God says, even the places that are empty and desolate and chaotic, those are places where I'm bringing provision and life and vegetation and rain. It reminds me of the passage that says that God's rain will fall on the just and the unjust alike, that the living vitality of water will come like springs of rain to bring new life, even in the places where that we think there only is desolation and waste. He goes on pushing in the direction of chaos by looking at all these pairs of animals, lions and ravens and mountain goats and deer and wild donkeys and wild oxen and ostriches and war horses and hawks and vultures. And after all of that, Job is like, I don't have any more words, man. You've given all the words. I got nothing. But God goes on and talks about the behemoth and the Leviathan, two of the grandest mythological creatures of chaos, and describes them with such beauty and such care and mastery that it leaves the reader with no choice but to say, even the most chaotic places in the universe are under the provision and care and creative activity of God. What Job didn't see, and what I think is part of what's happening here, is that the order of God's creation included more chaos than he would have liked. What we don't like to see and think about is that the order of God's provision and care would include more chaos or pain or suffering than we would ever like to give credence to. And when we experience those things, it shatters our world and calls into question the trustworthiness of God. That's happened to me. I know it's happened to some of you, right? But here's the good news that comes with the force of the speech from the whirlwind. It's a powerful statement, and it's one that I think anchors the future of Job. That says, this is Job's final response. He says this. After this huge speech, these two huge speeches, Job says, I know that you can do all things. It's a powerful statement, right? I know that you can do all things and that no purposes of yours can be thwarted. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore, I have uttered what I didn't understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. And he goes on, here I will speak, I will question you, and you declare to me, I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore, I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. The thing that I want you to pay attention to is the reorientation of his perception. Now my eyes have seen something different that I hadn't seen before. What is it that Job has seen that he hasn't seen before? I think it's this. That there's no situation, there's no pain or suffering or chaos that we experience in this life that puts us beyond the reach of God's creative energy and care. There is nothing, no situation that we experience, no pain or suffering or chaos that puts us beyond the reach of God's creative energy and care. It's even there with the Leviathan. It's even there with the behemoth. It's even there in the waste and desolate places. There was a woman who lost her son in a tragic accident, who woke up the day of the funeral seeking, needing, desperately something from God. And she reached for her scripture and her Bible, and she opened it up to the whirlwind speech out of Job. Not the place I would have gone, I'm just saying. Somebody asked her later, why did you do that? And this is what she said. She said, I needed to know that my pain was not all there was in the world. And maybe that's what you need to know. Maybe today you need to remember that your pain and suffering and chaos is not all there is in the world, that there is at the heart of all things a creative energy that comes from God, that is indestructible, and that is making for peace and healing and love. Let's pray. God, sometimes the words that we read and the words that we say feel so very much not enough. And we need your presence, and we need your power, and we need you to take we need you to take us up into your goodness and your presence and your power and your wisdom and your grace. We pray that today as we sing and as we offer all of our life to you, the good parts and the bad parts, the best days and the worst days, the order and beauty and goodness and the places it feels like we're cursed and in despair, we offer it all to you. We offer it all to you.